So I wanted to film a video to talk about grafting figs for growing in Central Florida and for other areas of the world where nematodes are an issue in the soil. So nematodes are really the big limiting factor to being able to grow figs in Florida. Otherwise, they're fairly well adapted plants. The humidity can be an issue, but the main reason people oftentimes they put a fig in the ground and it just sits there for years and it doesn't grow any height is because nematodes are infesting the roots. So myself and several friends have been working on learning more about grafting them onto other rootstocks in order to provide them with a root system that can tolerate our soil. So there are examples of trees in Florida that are quite old. I know of one that's 20 years old. That's a very large, successful fig tree that's grafted on this rootstock. So this is Ficus sycamorus. This is a species that's actually referenced in the Bible several times. So its cultivation goes back very far, and it does produce large figs that, in the right climate, ripen up to be an edible fruit. But this is totally tolerant of the types of nematodes that are present in our soil here in Central Florida. So this actually just broke out of this pot that I had it growing in, and it even is starting to form these roots that are up above the ground because it's so happy in the soil here. So this is about 5 years old, and if you graft the trees to this, the fig trees to this, you get a tree that has this root system behind it, but with the edible, desirable fig variety that's on top of the plant. So the first aspect of my experimentation with figs is trying to find varieties that are well adapted to Florida. So leaves that can tolerate humidity without getting diseases on them, and also fruit that doesn't rot, because figs either have a closed eye or an open eye. And the more closed the eye is, the less prone it is to having insects enter it and the rain getting in and rotting it. So most of these are selections that I'm growing out in large pots that are full of potting soil. Eventually the nematodes will get in there, but that gives them a jump start, and I'll get a few years out of them. I can evaluate the trees in the meantime while I'm getting them grafted onto the rootstock, which is the ultimate solution for them. So most of these are LSU varieties. There was a breeding program out of Louisiana to develop humidity tolerant figs. So we have LSU purple. This one's not LSU, but it's brown turkey, LSU Scots black, LSU improved Celeste, green Ischia, Cadota. Elsewhere on the farm we have Celeste and a number of other varieties I'm experimenting with. So for taking budwood, we're really too late. Most of the budwood was available a few weeks ago. Most of these are starting to leaf out and they're too far gone, but there's a few pieces left on here, so I'll show that are still good. So I'll show how to take these. So this one, see the bud here is still dormant, and there is a little bit of green visible underneath, which means it's starting to swell up and it's going to push out soon. So this is a viable piece. It's not the best. It would be preferable to get something else, but since our choices are kind of limited, we'll have to take this one. And then of course we want to remember the variety it is so that it's properly labeled down the road. So this one is LSU Scots Black. This is another example of one that could be used. It's actually just maybe a touch too far opened, but maybe yesterday or the day before it would have been good. This is one that I took scion wood off of maybe a week ago, and now this bud is kind of priming up, ready to grow. So I could take this as another piece of budwood, and the ones I've done like this seem like they're going to take. So. Okay, so here's a successfully grafted fig. This one is a LSU purple, and this was a rootstock that looked like this, and I've been slowly reducing the size of the rootstock canopy, which I'll get into. But here you can see this is fig Ficus carica foliage here, and this is the Ficus sycamorus foliage here. And so I did a side veneer graft, and you can see the union there. So it looks like this one's going to be a success, and we'll slowly move this up into a bigger pot, and eventually it'll go out into the farm. These here are a whole bunch of other ones that look like they've taken, and I've done maybe 30 or 40 this season, and I'm getting a pretty good success rate. So this is Ficus sycamorus, which is one rootstock option, but I've got a few others here that came from my friend Craig This one is Ficus glomerata, and this one I believe is Ficus palmata. So this rootstock is good in that it tolerates nematodes, but it is cold sensitive. So there's some concern that this rootstock could get frozen out from underneath of the tree on a really cold night. So we're experimenting with some other rootstocks that may also work. It would also be good to have some diversity of options. We may find for some reason down the road that one's better than another. So I would say in 6 months, this will be a nice big grafted specimen that'll be ready to go out. So there's a few things that make grafting these figs kind of challenging. They're not very straightforward like other trees. And I have people like Berto, who's a great fruit collector in Fort Myers, who taught me some things about this, and I'm learning as I go. So first thing, it seems that this particular species, if you do a cleft graft, meaning you cut the top off and you insert a cleft graft into it, oftentimes that results in a dieback that results from the wound created. Something about cutting this tree, it dies back and then you lose the graft. So side veneer seemed to be the way to go. Also, chip budding works okay too so far for me. So there are a few peculiarities to grafting these. Also, like I mentioned before, this is not ideal. I mean, it's okay, but this isn't great budwood. And this is kind of the runt of the litter of the trees that I have left for rootstock. So this is a rooted cutting. So I just take cuttings from the big ficus tree, I root them, grow them out for several months until they're about this size, and then they're a viable rootstock. So the first thing I'm gonna do with this is get a nice straight, oh, actually first thing is actually to sterilize my knife with rubbing alcohol. And this is just a Victorinox brand grafting knife, and then I get it dirty again. Also good to keep the pruners clean, which I already did. So I'll clean this up. I didn't make a very straight cut, so I'll take my knife and just make sure this is nice and straight. Don't cut your finger off when you do that. Then I wrap the scion up with parafilm. Some people prefer to use a product called Buddy Tape, but this stuff is cheaper and seems to work fine for me. So you just separate these layers. And then I wrap up everywhere that I'm not gonna cut, basically. And I go from bottom up, and then I'll make sometimes I'll do 2 layers over the bud, because sometimes just because the bud is so sharp there, it can cause a little tear that slowly opens up. Press all the air bubbles out of that. That's pretty good. And yeah, then I'll clean up the rootstock a little, remove all these side things just to get it nice and easy to work with. Sometimes I'll remove some of this low stuff just so I can see what I'm doing. Then I also like to just take a couple inches out of the top. My thinking being that kind of stressing the top of the tree will trigger it to push buds from below. I don't know how much legitimacy there is to that, but that's what I do. So I'm going to do a side veneer where I'm going to line up this flat surface to that flat surface. The fig wood is very knobby and hard to work with, which is one of the aspects of grafting these that makes it challenging. So we'll go with that plane right there. You can kind of see how that's going to line up to sit flush with that. So I'll go in here, and now I'm not an awesome grafter, so a lot of times my cuts end up looking pretty ugly, but they seem to take anyways. That's pretty decent there. I'll put a little chip on the back of it that's going to sit. So it's a pretty nice flat cut there. And then that's where the tab on the back of the side veneer is going to sit. All right, so I hold this like this while I work because you don't want this to touch any soil. Now, ficus are full of white sap. You can see some emerging here. Something I learned from somebody grafting figs is to, and this is true of other species in this family, you can sink your knife in below where you're going to graft ahead of time, a few seconds, make a few little incisions, and the sap will start pouring out here, and that preempts that sap from flooding up into where you do your graft. If all that sap pours up into the graft union, it kills the graft. So last year I did a whole bunch of these that failed, and I think that was the problem. All right, so I'll proceed with the graft. So I'll make a corresponding cut to my little chip I did there, and I've got a nice flat section that I'm working with. All right, and then I use this to determine how high up I'm gonna cut. So about there, and I'm trying to match the width of this cut to the other cut. Ooh. All right, so I'm gonna proceed just for the sake of finishing this video, but that has a rot inside, and I've been finding this every great once in a while. I think it's maybe cold damage from previous years, and so there's a rot inside of the center. So normally I would discard this one when I find that, but just to finish here, I'll do this. So this fits in there. Yeah, see that actually worked pretty good. So you can see a touch of air, but I can, and sometimes I'll clean these up. If there's, I can just come here and then remove a little wedge there just to make that, whatever you need to do to make the cambium layers touch. So that's pretty good right there. So now I use grafting tape. This is different than the parafilm. This stuff's very tough, and you can really crank down and tighten the graft up. So I line up, make sure one side is lined up like that. Then I'll move kind of slow. Sometimes I'll use a piece of parafilm before I start wrapping. Oh, this one's kind of wiggly. So I'll do a gentle wrap first. A more ideal piece of budwood would be hanging on there better. I'm going to tie that off. So it's still a little loose. Now we can use parafilm to fix this up a little. So one thing is you can twist the parafilm like this if you want to tighten down. So I'll do that first, just to get that tightened up a little. Make sure it's still lined up. And then you want to use the parafilm also to cover up all these exposed areas. So I like to come over the top, cover that up, and then just kind of bend it around, stretch it out, and make sure there's no exposed area where a drop of water could get in there, because that'll kill the graft. So that's about it. That should take, and then of course put the label on. This is another experimental kind of graft that I tried, and I did one and it seems to be taking, so I figured it would be interesting to show. It's a kind of a cleft graft on tender green wood with tender green budwood like this. It's kind of useful because you can root a cutting, and then in a month, these new shoots that come out, you can already get something off of it to work with to graft. So this one looked something like this. I topped it, cleft grafted that in. The cleft graft into this tender green wood doesn't seem to cause the same dieback issue that I mentioned earlier. This may ultimately not be great in the long term, but so far it seems to be working, so I think it's worth experimenting with. So what I do for this graft is I have this tender green pliable wood, and we definitely want to remove all the foliage off of this. This is just drying the plant out, and I'm being careful not to damage buds as I do this. Very easy to slide through and take out the terminal bud, which we don't want to do. And I'm going to take this little leaf, also needs to come out, which is kind of tedious. All right, so there's our wood. Shorten this up just a touch, make a nice straight cut. These are kind of easy because they're so soft and they're very straight. So I wrap this up basically the same way that I do the other. The only difference is at the tip, you got to be a little more careful not to damage the bud. On the last ones I did, I just kind of stretched the parafilm out and then just fold it over and just kind of scrunch it up. And it was actually able to push out of that with no issue. All right. So I'm going to graft it on about here, I think. So you can use your knife or pruners here. And I'm going to go ahead and remove this stuff because we don't need that around anymore. We want it to push out right here. And I just cut this into a straightforward cleft graft. There's so much cambial tissue here that it doesn't need to be quite as precise as some other kinds of grafts, which is nice. Okay, so I'll do the same thing I did earlier. I'm going to make a few gashes here to release some sap, because I can see there's a ton of sap building up at the end. I am going to dab that to clean it up. So the sap's coming out where I made my gashes. Hopefully that'll help us. All right, and this is just really the same width, so that's good. That went a little further than I want. Sometimes they split on you because of the width of the knife. It's not too bad though. Just cut off a little bit. This tissue is kind of tender, so you don't want to shove it in there too aggressively. All right, that looks pretty good. And this can be wrapped up with parafilm, which I just had one little piece left. So in this case, you want to kind of stretch and pull tight to work out the imperfections so that the scion and budwood are nice and snug. And also we're trying to keep out moisture, keep everything from also drying out. And that looks like I'm just gonna make it here. All right, so that's it. And then of course the last step is to label. All right, so I did 2 grafts on this tree. This one is a side veneer, which looks like it failed, but I also did a chip bud, which is just putting 1 bud. It's like a side veneer, but it's just 1 bud, and you can see that is taking. So this seems to be a viable way to graft these as well, especially if you have limited budwood. I ran out of parafilm out here, so I'm not gonna do one of those to show you, but there's the idea of it. And then one last thing I wanted to mention is how to root the cuttings of the Ficus sycamorus. So they're very easy. You want to take a cutting that is an ideal diameter to graft into. So this one's pretty good. And I like to just take 2 or 3 of these and put them in a small pot and hope that one takes. If more than one take, I just clip off the weakest 2, and then you'll be sure you have one per pot. And then I'll move them up out of a small pot into these 1 gallons, and I graft onto them once they're in the 1 gallons. And I also wanted to thank Grafting Cliff, who's a great fruit collector of Florida and grafter, and he taught me a lot about these figs, and also Berto and also Craig Hepworth, the Florida Fruit Geek. And some people may see my grafts and say, oh, those aren't really that, you know, nice and straight cuts and stuff like that. It's true, and we're all learning together here, and I mostly wanted to make this video to document what I've learned so far about this, but there's a lot more to be learned about grafting figs and about new rootstocks and about different strategies for doing this. So if you have useful information about this, maybe from another country or even here in Florida, I'd love to hear more, and thank you for watching this video.